Okay, I guess we can get started now that we know the meeting is being recorded, which I think you're all aware of. I'm John Parascandola, and I want to welcome you to this session, Panel 2 on Drug Regulation, Knowledge, and Us. Just a little bit of housekeeping. I want to ask everyone to make sure that your video is off and your microphone is muted, at least during the presentations and in fact throughout the session, because if you have questions, please put them on the chat. So I'm not going to take a lot of time here. I want to leave all the time for the speakers and the discussion. I'm going to introduce each of the speakers, all of them at once at the beginning, so that I can get out of the way and let them speak. And then we're going to take questions at the end rather than between presentations. And again, please enter your questions into the chat box. Our first speaker is Nydia Olvera Hernandez, who is professor at the National School of Anthropology and History at the Autonomous University of Mexico City, and also a PhD candidate in history at the Mora Institute in Mexico City, and is researching drug control in the middle of the 20th century in Mexico. And we're going to hear a piece of that research today. The paper is entitled The Mexican Pharmacopoeia, the Inclusion of Psychoactive National Drugs in the Official Medicine, 1846 to 1930. She will be followed by Chris Blakely, who's currently an adjunct professor at Pepperdine University and Loyola Marymount University, and also a postdoctoral research associate at UCLA. And today's paper on the global history of Columba, the Columba route, is part of a project, a broader project on medical pluralism and the African diaspora in early modern history. And the title of that paper for today is Macumwa. That's the best I can do in Swahili. Macumwa, Columba, and Miami Colombo, Slavery and Expropriated Pharmacology from the Swahili Coast to the Ohio Valley. And then the final paper will be by Michael Lewis, and Michael is professor of sociology at Christopher Newport University in Newport News, Virginia. His latest book, which just came out this year, is Prohibition's Greatest Myths, the Distilled Truths About America's Anti-Alcohol Crusade. And his paper today is entitled From Barrooms to Drugstores to Dispensaries, the Evolutionary Response to the Liquor Problem in Athens, Georgia, 1891. And so I'm going to turn it over now to Nydia for the first paper and mute myself.
Thank you very much, John. I'm going to share the presentation, and I made a little change on the title. On the dates, I was going to finish on 1961. You are going to see why. So I'm going to talk about this paper, Mexican Pharmacopoeia, the inclusion of psychoactive drugs in official medicine. Mexico is famous for have a wide variety of, but you're not looking the, okay. Mexico is famous for have a wide variety of psychoactive endemic species. Plenty plants and mushrooms were used in religion, ritual, and medical practices by pre-Columbian societies. But when colonizers arrived in 16th century, these practices were considered idolatries related to sorcery and the devil, and were prohibited and persecuted by the Holy Inquisition. But even colonial authorities distinguished that the uses that seem irrational from those they consider mere superstitions, like those medicinal uses that did not include the psychoactive effects, mainly the topical uses or in low doses of species like peyote, toloache, that is a kind of datura, or yuki, or morning glory, and ribea, that the name is Ribera corimbosa, and psilocybin mushrooms. They usually were used like ointments to treat gout and pain. So in this paper aims to analyze the national pharmacopoeias and other medical sources which show to corroborate the indigenous uses and the properties of psychoactive species, local and foreign. I will especially analyze material written between 1846 and 1961, and I'm going to focus in two plants, one endemic from Mexico, peyote, and the other plant that arrives in colonial times and was incorporated in local, traditional, and official medicine, marijuana. So by the 19th century, various alkaloids were isolated in the world, like morphine, cocaine, and heroin. At the end of this century, these alkaloids and other opium preparations, such as Dover powders or laudanum, were already being sold in the pharmacies and drugstores of Mexico, as well as marijuana, toloache, peyote, and other herbs in markets and with traditional healers. But this time, psychoactive plants were analyzed in the Mexican institutions like the National University and the Mexican Pharmaceutical Society. Some of these investigations were published in the Medical Gazette of Mexico. So you can see this journal, and that in this journal, some of the articles describe topics such as cocaine and its applications to replace the lack of nutrition due its properties on the digestive tract and the nervous system. Other articles talk about the multiple therapeutic application of opium. And this is an interesting case that article talk about a kind of Mexican opium. It's supposed that the scientists want to exploit this plant because they say that if we have in Mexico this plant, we can avoid fraud derived from the introduction of foreign products and to obtain advantage from cheapness. In this text, it does not mention which species, but some scientists say that it's this Mexican opium is this plant, chicalotes, or Argemona mexicana, a plant of the same genus as Papaver somniferum with various therapeutic applications and which can be toxic. The national pharmacopoeias began to be published in the 19th century, starting in 1846. This manual would have the objective of determining the appropriate conditions and the dosage for prescribing drugs, chemical products, and other pharmaceutical preparations. The first pharmacopoeia included various recipes with opium, like laudanum or syrup, cocaine, coca leaves, cannabis, and other international or global drugs. The therapeutic application with plants, also like the toloache, that is this that harmonium. It's a plant very famous in Mexico for its use like a love potion. Scientists found that the harmonium had analgesic and antispasmodic properties, although they also pointed out its toxicity. Other plants is tobacco, that was recommended as an enema for intestinal contractions and as a tincture against pain. Other plant, for example, is the Theobroma cacao, or the chocolate, that was used since then as a body lotion. Other plants, some less known or with no clear psychoactive effects, like the colorine, that is Erythrina coralloides, was described paralyzing properties on the motor nerves of the extremities, and that it has narcotic properties. So let's remember these are descriptions of these plants found in this first Mexican pharmacopoeia. Then I'm going to talk about two plants. First, peyote. This cactus, Lophophora williamsi, well known as peyote, was an important subject of study among Mexican scientists, especially because it is an endemic plant of Mexico. For example, in 1913, the National Institute of Medicine published an article titled The Peyote Study that mentioned that indigenous people apply it externally against snake bites for burns, wounds, and rheumatism, for which they chew it or simply moisten it in their mouth before putting it on the injured parts. It also served to fortify walkers. They rub their joints with the ground root, and this way they could walk long distances without getting tired. Peyote was described in the Latin American Pharmacopoeia in 1921. It was mentioned that it could serve as a hair tonic or to stimulate the brain, for which 2 tablespoons of 10% tincture were prescribed. In addition, this manual mentions that peyotina, a substance that supposed to have peyote, was used as an intravenous tranquilizer for various cases of insanity. Another interesting research is this. It's a dissertation of a doctor, Jose Mazzotti, in which he compiled historical and anthropological data on the botanic and the geographical distribution of this plant. He pointed out that for his study, he tried to obtain samples from different parts of the country, which he only managed to obtain from the state of Zacatecas in North Mexico. With this peyote, this is the samples that he put the photography on his dissertation. He made chemical studies, and he cites that of the alkaloids already found by Lewin, and he managed to isolate 3 and separate other crystals and components of the plant: mescaline, anilodine, and hydrochloride anilodine. Those of these substances were applied in his experiments with animals such as dogs, frogs, and turtles. No? For example, this is an image of the hair of the frog when he applied the peyote extract, and this is from the turtle. He also applied on humans intravenously, and he said that mescaline described like a thick, bitter liquid, dark brown in color, alkaline in reaction, soluble in water, alcohol, benzol, and much in chloroform. He said that the main property that can use medicinal of the peyote, it was like on the properties on the heart. So, but then we don't have a lot of information about that. Then I'm going to speak about this other plant, marijuana or cannabis. That's a question because that's one of the questions that the scientists in Mexico is going to make. Was made. Hemp arrived to Mexican territory from the Old World since colonial times in order to take advantage of its fibers. However, the indigenous people who already had an ancestral experience in the use of psychoactive species soon realized their different properties and integrate cannabis into their religious, ritual, and medicinal practice. By the 19th century, this rapid assimilation of cannabis by the indigenous population and other popular groups had generated prejudice and some confusions. Likewise, the word marijuana had already begun to be used in Mexico. The etymology of this expression is not certain. What is certain is that it's a contribution of Mexican popular culture to the global terminology of drugs. Various therapeutic uses of cannabis were already widespread among indigenous groups and popular classes when this plant began to be of interest to doctors. During the 19th century, in his thesis on marijuana, Dr. Genaro Perez mentioned that in some populations of the Republic they use a beverage prepared with the seeds of marijuana as a treatment for gonorrhea, and he also alludes the therapeutic action of the herb to treat hallucinations of the insane, stomach disorders, asthma, and use the seeds for irritation of the urinary tract. He also said that cannabis, the extract of this plant, is used for neurosis and mental derangement. So one of the confusion is the belief that cannabis and marijuana are different plants, and some scientists this time say that marijuana was endemic from Mexico and its psychoactive effects are stronger than cannabis. Even in the New Mexican Pharmacopoeia published in 1886, hemp and marijuana were recognized as two different species. The first was botanically identified as cannabis and pointed out that the emulsion obtained from seeds was commonly used as an emollient and in inflammation. And of marijuana, they only mention on the pharmacopoeia that it had sedative and hypnotic properties. On the first half of the 20th century, scientific research on various psychoactive plants was published in Mexico. The importance of these species among indigenous communities and in popular medicine was an interest for doctors. But in some times they mentioned that it's exoticism and some prejudice such as racial, moral, and the accusation of being uncivilized will be later stimulated with the legal provision of cannabis. These scientific investigations range from simple observations of consumers, chemical analysis, study the ways of obtaining their extracts and consumption, the botanical classification of the plant, and experimentation on people and animals, as well as various therapeutic applications. By the 30s, it was said by doctors that its active ingredient in marijuana was cannabis or hashishina, a resin soluble in alcohol. In addition, some doctors studied the therapeutic applications of this plant for multiple diseases such as asthma, hemorrhoids, rheumatism, migraine, menstrual cramps, and other pains, and as a sedative for insomnia and mental depressions. So it was not until the third decade of 20th century that it began to know that marijuana wasn't endemic to Mexico. In his thesis, Dr. Guzman pointed out that the species had arrived during colonial period and that Indians gave its name of marijuana, and that it had widely used in prisons among soldiers and people of the popular class. And in this moment also, these doctors began to express his concerns about the moral, intellectual, and physical damage of the consumption of these plants. One famous Mexican scientist that made marijuana research was Leopoldo Salazar Vinegra. In 1938, Dr. Salazar published The Myths of Marijuana, an article that had the goal to eradicate some information about cannabis. It was based on empiric experimentation with dogs and frogs in inhalation boxes, and people, including other scientists, students, or the mentally ill. In addition, Salazar considered marijuana laws unjustified and excessive, and that the drug policies should be based on a health approach and not criminalizing consumers. He believed that the only way to take power from drug traffickers was to decriminalize and regulate substance. So this research of this doctor influenced on historical moment in 1940s in Mexico when the drugs were legalized. But the ideas of Leopoldo Salazar weren't approved by Mexican and North American politicians. Since the publication of the in 1988, a translation of this paper came into the hands of Harry Aslinger. These are the inhalation boxes and the dog that was put on the inhalation. And this paper, the marijuana myth, got to the hands of Harry Aslinger, and in the Federal Bureau of Narcotics opened a file of investigation into Dr. Salazar and tried to discredit his research in one of the meetings of the League of Nations. In Mexico, he and his student, Jorge Segura Millán, had been warned by the Mexican government that the use of cannabis was illegal, even for scientific purposes, and that he had to stop his studies. However, it was not until 1962 that cannabis was officially withdrawn from the national pharmacopoeias, precisely after the Single Convention of Narcotic Drugs of the United Nations. In the case of peyote, it was also withdrawn around the same time, although it was prohibited for up to 10 years with the conventions against psychotropics. So I'm going to stop here for the discussion, but that's but I decided to choose one foreign and one local plant, and how the local scientists made knowledge with these plants and try to say what uses are right or were rational and were not. So thank you.
Thank you, Nydia. And I think we will now move along to the next paper by Chris. So if you want to take it.
Can everyone see my screen? All right, and I trust that you can also hear me. I want to begin by saying thank you to Greg, Luke, and especially Kristen for organizing this conference. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today. And thank you also to John for chairing our panel. Today, my intent is to rethink a plant, columba root, known among Kiswahili speakers in Southeast Africa as mkamwa, as a scientific object whose global biography as a pharmaceutical spans the 17th and 19th centuries. Columba's mobile story is embedded in two epochs in world history. First, the route moved through the Southeast African slave trade and diaspora, initiated by the Portuguese Empire in the 16th century as Banganga healers taken from entrepôts on the Swahili coast arrived at points across the Indian Ocean world. In 17th century Europe, columba became an Indies drug due to its association and social and material trajectory in the Indian Ocean. In the 18th century, when Northern Europeans fully adopted and experimented with Mozambique root, physicians and apothecaries associated the drug with South Asia for a number of reasons, including prevailing Orientalist attitudes towards Asian medical knowledge and Enlightenment beliefs about the allegedly primitive and even dangerous nature of sub-Saharan African medicine. While British colonial Orientalists valued South Asian knowledge as potentially equal to European science, naturalists circulated ideas about sub-Saharan Africa as a scientific void in the late 18th century as columba became widely known. So the first thesis I present is that columba represents a material instantiation of the simultaneous denial and adoption of Southeast African pharmacology via slavery in early modern Europe. I locate the second arc of Columba's history in the progress of settler colonialism in the Trans-Appalachian West during the early Republic period of the United States. In the wake of the American Revolution and the subsequent disruption of drug supplies to the new nation, American pharmacists sought a botanical substitute for columba by searching the Ohio Valley for herbs with similar properties. This search drew naturalists and druggists into contact with sovereign indigenous polities who possessed thousands of years of medical knowledge. When Americans found a columba root in the Ohio Valley, yellow gentian, their claims to understanding and acquiring the drug were coeval to the physical dispossession of indigenous nations by settlers and the emerging American state and imperial apparatus. My second thesis is that Euro-American medical knowledge emerged from settler colonialism, a process dependent on patterns of erasure similar to those involved in the expropriation of Southeast African science. My narrative of columba as a scientific object is an effort to bring together historiographical conversations surrounding the history of medicine, drugs, and slavery, the global African diaspora, settler colonialism, and the role of African and indigenous science in the Enlightenment. Drawing from Benjamin Breen's scholarship on the global drug trade, I framed the erasure of columba's African origins as part of an effort among Europeans to decontextualize Indies drugs and deny or downplay African science and medicine that coincided with the rise of Atlantic slavery. Moreover, the Americans who took up the drug they came to call Miami columba root represented themselves as, quote, Indian doctors, end quote, and their stylized self-fashioning recalls familiar patterns of playing Indian in settler colonial history. I see laying out the mobile history of columba as a small contribution toward broader efforts among scholars like Chakanetsa Mavunga and Robin Wall Kimmerer to decolonize and re-Africanize the history of science and to illuminate the indigenous foundations of American medicine. Given my limited time today, I will discuss a few key moments in columba's history, beginning with the first mention of the plant in Europe in 1671, and concluding with a discussion of Miami columba by an American physician in 1813. Francesco Redi, a Florentine physician and naturalist, described columba as a great alexipharmac in his book, Knowledge of Diverse Natural Things, particularly those that are brought from the Indies, in 1671. Reddy stylized his discussion of natural things in the form of a letter addressed to the German Jesuit natural philosopher Athanasius Kircher. Among the Indies drugs that attracted Reddy's attention were vanilla, cinchona, Maldivian coconuts, a snake stone from Mombasa, and Tunisian scorpions. In the text, Reddy did not identify the geographic origins of Columba. However, he discussed elsewhere the Southeast African root attributed to João Lopes Pinheiro and Radicha de la Manica, or a Manica root. This root's name reflects its use by Manica speakers, a group of Shona people residing in the present-day regions of eastern Zimbabwe and the western Mozambique highlands. Reddy relayed that Manica root could be found in a place called Chitevi, between Manica and Sofala provinces in Mozambique. 2 decades later, the Dutch microscopist Anthony van Leeuwenhoek described the Indian Columba root in his book on the secrets of nature detected in 1695. Leeuwenhoek obtained specimens of the plant along with various kinds of medicine and seeds from a doctor who lived somewhere in the East Indies, possibly either at Java, Ceylon, or Ambon Island. It's likely Leeuwenhoek received his specimens of the Columba root from a surgeon of the Dutch East India Company, as the company's bases included places where Portuguese slavers delivered Southeast African captives, especially Ceylon, Malacca, and the Molucca Islands. Portuguese slavers trafficked captives first from slave depots at Mozambique and Madagascar to Goa before transshipping slaves from the Malabar coast to Ceylon. In 17th century Ceylon, the VOC imported enslaved laborers from southern India, and these people labored alongside communities of, quote, Kaffir slaves, end quote, that existed on the island since the late 16th century. In 1697, the Portuguese physician João Carvalho Semedo discussed Columba in his encyclopedic study of galenicals and chemicals, Polyanthea medicinal. Semedo's sources for obtaining and preparing Columba included Francisco Roballo Freire, the chief physician of the Estado da India at Goa. Semedo recommended raised de Columba as a febrifugal drug and included various recipes for preparing the root to be ingested. In the early 18th century, knowledge among Europeans with a direct connection to the Portuguese Empire concerning the origins of Columba root began to change since Reddy's brief description of the great alexipharmic from 1671. In 1713, while en route to Tibet, the Italian Jesuit Ippolito Desideri arrived on Ilha de Mozambique to rest at the college founded by the society in 1640 before sailing on to Goa. Desideri and his party waited on the island for, quote, ships from Senna, which bring a quantity of large elephant tusks, gold, silver, and black amber, as well as many Kaffirs or Negroes, slaves bought there to be sold at Goa, end quote. Desideri's geographic reference here likely refers to both the town of Senna, located near the southern banks of the Zambezi River in Sofala province, and the Senna people, an ethno-linguistic group indigenous to the northwestern region of Mozambique. Portuguese slavers purchased captives from indigenous slavers, including Makua and Yao traders in northern and western Mozambique. Quote, so many slaves are embarked at Mozambique, end quote, Desideri learned, that, quote, the ships are crowded and become very filthy. In Goa, they fetch high prices on account of their strength and fidelity, end quote. Below his descriptions of the captives, the missionary added observations on the flora he discovered through conversation with his peers on the island. Desideri learned that the Jesuits at the college collect many useful herbs, especially Columba and Lopo roots, both much esteemed in India. The first is a yellow root often used with good results. Pulverizing Columba and mixing the root with water, he explained, could be excellent for opening obstructed bowels. If one plunged a hot iron into the mixture, the drink would produce the opposite effect. Desideri hoped to collect additional plant simples known for their marvelous healing properties while on Ilha de Mozambique, or by venturing onto the mainland. Yet these two, Columba and João Lopes Pinheiro root, are the only plants from the Swahili coast that appeared in his narrative. Among the enslaved Desideri encountered were people who possessed knowledge of healing plants. In ethno-linguistic groups who spoke languages from the Bantu language family, located in West Central Africa and East Africa, Banganga or Nganga Mbuki healers used herbal therapeutics for treating diverse diseases. Such individuals may have used other terms from different languages to describe themselves, including Asinganga, Wanganga, Inyanga, or Tinyanga, terms which healers in present-day Tanzania, Mozambique, and South Africa continue to employ. These healers likely considered Columba as a muti or umuti, a category of materia medica that included herbs, minerals, and animals. In Bantu languages, bilongo refers to any combination of muti, including plants compounded together. And it is possible Banganga produced medicines from mixing Columba and other plants. The plant is still found and used among healers in present-day Kenya, Malawi, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. Zooming ahead to 1772, the Manchester apothecary Thomas Percival began experimenting with Columba, a plant he first knew as the Reis de Mozambique, and claimed he was unable to obtain any satisfactory information concerning its natural history. The celebrated Linnaeus is unacquainted with it. Despite the plant's name, Mozambique root, Percival argued that the root originated in South Asia. He affirmed to his readers that, quote, the Columba root grew originally on the continent of Asia and was from thence transplanted to Colombo, a town in Ceylon, which now gives its name to it and supplies all India with it, end quote. South Asian communities, he continued, have for a long time used it in disorders of the stomach and bowels. The Mancunian put Columba into the laboratory in a series of trials to produce an optimal tincture for treating gastrointestinal disease like dysentery and diarrhea. Percival's Columba essays influenced a number of chemists to take up experimenting with the root, including Joseph Priestley, John Coakley Lettsom, and William Jones, who at the time served as president of the Asiatic Society of Bengal in Kolkata. In dozens of medical textbooks, apothecary catalogs, and pharmaceutical books, authors over and over described the Mozambique root as being native to Colombo, Ceylon, or somewhere on the continent of Asia. Timothy Walker and Eugenia Rodriguez have shown how Portuguese officials in Goa at this time knew full well that the root came from Southeast Africa. However, these colonial reports were never read by apothecaries like Percival, who never entertained the idea that the Mozambique root derived from African science. Across the globe, physicians in the United States in the early 19th century hoped to find indigenous substitutes for Columba root as part of a broader attempt to reduce their dependence on foreign drug supplies and as a means to provide and promote North American materia medica. Physicians looked to the Trans-Appalachian West as a region for collecting new American drugs. Richard Brown learned that herbalists in Kentucky referred to a plant Orobunch virginiana as Columbo root, and by other names such as cancer root and beech drop. Cherokee herbalists used beech drops for centuries for treating diarrhea. While studying the medical flora of the Ohio Valley, Daniel Drake learned of a bitter root said to be the officinal columba that attracted the attention of numerous physicians in the Trans-Appalachian West. Ohio physicians began referring to this plant as American Columbo. Peter Smith, who advertised himself as an Indian doctor, because I have incidentally obtained a knowledge of many of the simples used by the Indians, and in the manner of indigenous healers, likewise encouraged doctors to use Freshera carolinensis, which he terms Miami Columbo root, for treating fevers. Quote, the use of this root will, Smith predicted, supersede that of the Jesuits' barks in the near future, end quote. Smith framed his appropriation of indigenous knowledge as a means to contrast his straightforward empiricism against what he argued was the unnecessarily speculative or theoretical medicine of university-trained physicians. Like beech drops, Cherokee speakers used yellow gentian for centuries before the arrival of Europeans to treat fevers. Like Banganga described in Europe as fetisheers, Americans marginalized native healers as they despiritualized indigenous medical traditions. Columba's global history reflects how European physicians and apothecaries denied the plant's Southeast African provenance for decades, even as they adopted it as a useful drug. European denials over Columba as an African pharmaceutical stem from a lack of knowledge about Southeast Africa, attitudes about sub-Saharan Africans as intellectually primitive, and due to efforts to distance European medicine from the spiritual and sacred practices of West Central African fetisheers. At the same time, Britons and others embraced its Asian character as part of a wider Orientalist trend. Pursuing Columba and the Kaffir healers taken from the Swahili coast to India demonstrates how slavery, diaspora, and Southeast African science shaped early modern European medicine. Moreover, joining the story to the American quest to find a substitute for Columba in the Ohio Valley reveals how United States doctors sought to expropriate indigenous knowledge and shapeshift into Indian doctors. My aim here is to lay a foundation for future research on the intersection between medicine, slavery, and diaspora among Africans and indigenous people in the late Enlightenment. Yet I acknowledge that the analysis presented here remains Eurocentric. relying foremost on printed books, advertisements, and scientific journals. Finally, I see my own discussion of Southeast African and indigenous healers here as unsatisfying and requiring further effort to more fully center these individuals into the narrative, and more broadly within the history of science, pharmacy, and medicine at large. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. And moving right along, we'll go to Michael next.
Hello, everyone. Let me get my, hang on a second here. There we go. Hi, everyone. My name is Michael Lewis. I'd like to start by thanking Kristen and Greg for being so helpful throughout this entire process. Thanks to John for hosting us today, and to Nydia and Chris for some very interesting thoughts. It's a daunting task to follow both of you. I should start by saying that I, too, had hoped to have a really robust and wonderful PowerPoint, but sadly, all the artifacts I had hoped to gather to put in such a PowerPoint got COVIDed, in the sense that I hadn't had a chance to get to some of those archives yet. So you'll have to make do with this screen, and if you feel free like you want to wander off, by all means, I understand why. I come to the study of pharmacies through a focus on prohibition, specifically United States prohibition. At the same time that anti-alcohol activists were campaigning for this radical solution to what they called the liquor problem, others were experimenting with state-run liquor stores, which they called dispensaries back then. We know how that story ends. Prohibition was tried and failed, and in its wake, the United States turned back to the dispensary idea in the form of state-run ABC stores, many of which still exist today, and in fact, there's one about 5 minutes from my house just down the road here. The United States wasn't the only country to play around with the idea of reforming rather than prohibiting liquor sales. But while the United States emphasized off-site consumption, other countries' versions preferenced on-site consumption. So rather than dispensaries, they merely modified their pubs, their taverns, their bars, with an eye towards curbing the worst of those influences. I think that the reason that these two different outcomes happen is because of the different kinds of outlets that they sought to replace. While in Europe, virtually all liquor sales were done through bars and taverns and pubs, in the United States South, reformers had already often replaced saloons with pharmacies. Thus, when they went to nationalize, put together state policies, it was the pharmacy that U.S. state liquor stores sought to emulate. By way of background, very briefly, the intervention that spawned both liquor dispensaries and European reformed taverns was initially attempted in Sweden. Swedish reformers pointed out that the profit motive would always lead liquor retailers to want to sell more, and that impressionable minors and habitual drunkards, amongst many, would make easy targets for such sales. To better control drunkenness and prevent future drinkers from starting down that path, the Swedish city of Gothenburg removed liquor sales from private hands and substituted a semi-private trust in which shareholders would receive a maximum return of 5%. And then all other profits were set aside for funding libraries, parks, museums, and other civic improvements. The people who ran these liquor outlets were to receive a salary that was not tied in any way to the amount of liquor sold, thus removing the incentive for liquor sales to those most vulnerable. Both European and American adaptations of this alternative to prohibition shared the Swedish intention of limiting private profit through disinterested management, but reformers drew on more local institutional forms when crafting models for their particular purposes. In the United States South, the institutional form most readily available for adaptation was the pharmacy. Pharmacies as replacements for saloons were first adopted in 1885 when the citizens of Athens, Georgia, voted to make their town saloon-free. The resulting prohibition law initially made no exception for medicinal use, but concerns of local physicians led Athenians to modify this stance. Here's the editor of the Athens Banner encapsulating their sentiments. He wrote, There's no danger of any man dying for want of the ardent, but if we make it an easy matter for all to secure liquor, then we undo a grand work and had just as well relicense barrooms. We would favor, however, a slight modification of the law to meet such cases as our physicians think need liquor to preserve people's health, and at the same time to prevent any one drugstore from monopolizing the trade along that line. Let's issue a license to drugstores as they see fit and proper to fill the liquor prescriptions for regular practicing physicians in good standing. Then let's require such drugstores to keep a list of every order they fill with the name of the party who buys it and the physician that prescribes it. This record then will be laid before the grand jury for critical examination, and they can judge as to whether any druggist or physician is abusing the privilege. If it is seen that any man has used an unnecessary amount of liquor, or a drugstore has sold too much, or a physician is suspiciously liberal, then this body can withhold further license. It seemed like a good idea when they pioneered it in 1887. The medical modification unfortunately led to the creation of what came to be derisively referred to as drugstore barrooms. Illegal liquor dealers, seeing the medical waiver for the loophole that it was, disguised their business to look like drugstores, but ran them as liquor shops, where all that was needed for the purchase of alcohol was a doctor's note that could be had for a nominal fee. Here's the Weekly Banner again in 1889, 2 years later, lampooning these businesses. Quote, "Dr. Setup is a regular practicing physician, and the law gives him the privilege to prescribe and furnish liquor to his patients. He opens a drugstore and invests a large part of his capital in whiskey and beer. Colonel Thirsty feels there is a vacuum attached to his anatomy and at once repairs to Dr. S for a prescription. The doctor proceeds to examine the throat of his new patient, decides that he needs a stimulant, and writes one extending over several months. It is not unreasonable to estimate that this little business will net its enterprising proprietor over $5,000 a year, and all that he is required to pay for this privilege is $100 physician tax to the city. Occasionally, our vigilant chief of police will docket a few cases against Dr. Setup, but it is a most amusing legal farce. The doctor employs a lawyer, the witnesses swear that the liquor was sold to them under prescription, and the culprit is acquitted. Thus the work goes on. There is no diminution of the number of whiskey drinkers, nor is there any less liquor sold." These exposés continued unabated for another year or so, at which point the Weekly Banner frustratingly opined, quote, "We believe this system of licensing drugstores to sell liquor is doing a great deal to break down the enforcement of the law. Let's amend our local bills so as to establish a dispensary in Athens. Then let's let the city refuse to grant any licenses and break up all these drugstores at any cost." When the Athenians appealed to the state to amend their liquor law, they initially imagined there would be little quibbling with their proposed solution, although they acknowledged that a whiskey peddling oligarchy would be rather a new phase of government monopoly. Such a choice was understood to be entirely consistent with the spirit that gives life and force to the entire prohibition movement. There was an 1885 statewide local option law already on the books that had given counties considerable freedom in determining their local liquor laws, and the state legislature had generally shown reticence in interfering with this arrangement. In addition to this fealty toward local option, Athenians also noted that the proposed dispensary plan, quote, "is not so much different from affairs as they now exist in Athens. Now, a practicing physician can prescribe it and drugstores can sell it. The dispensary simply takes the sale out of the hands of physicians and drugstores and puts it under control of the city." When it came time to consider the dispensary bill, however, several Georgia state legislatures remained concerned about the proposed dispensary would become something more than a minor alteration of a drugstore. In fact, it would function as a barroom. Legislators offered two amendments aimed at combating this unwanted development. The first aimed to limit the profit motive that might tempt dispensary employees the way it had already tempted barkeepers and physicians to sell liquor to drunkards and minors. An amendment was offered, quote, providing that nothing in this act shall be construed to allow any profit from the sale of liquor by the dispensary to be used for any purpose other than to defray the expenses incident in the dispensary. In this way, they thought they could sell liquor for keeping down immorality and for the good of the community, but not for any more profit than was necessary. The second proposal focused on the demand side, cutting down the number of legitimate purposes for liquor by mandating that no liquor should be sold under this act except for medicinal and mechanical purposes. If the proposed dispensary sold liquor for general purposes, argued one senator, then is a barroom, pure and simple, and my vote shall never be cast to license a barroom in Georgia. Other senators held their nose and reluctantly agreed to vote for the new liquor dispensary, with one senator opining, I favor this because it seems that the people of Athens are determined to have whiskey. If they must, it would be better for them to have pure whiskey, restricted and regulated. I do so with great apprehension. Eventually, the bill passed, but in its passage, it also made clear the limits to future such enterprises. Municipal dispensaries were deemed appropriate responses to the liquor question only if they looked enough like the controlled, regulated environment of the drugstore and not like a barroom. Municipal dispensaries next appeared in North Carolina with an 1895 petition to the state legislature from the town of Waynesville. Similar to Athens, Waynesville had adopted prohibition some years earlier and was dissatisfied with the results. Working directly from the Athens dispensary law, Waynesville's state representatives sought a special local act that would permit their town to establish a dispensary of their own. Once in operation, the Waynesville dispensary provided inspiration for other North Carolina towns to follow the same course in dealing with their liquor problems. The new system, wrote the Chatham Record, is preferable to so-called prohibition with its drugstores and blind tigers. Summing up the annual report of Waynesville's Dispensary Commission in 1897, the Courier noted the $3,000 profit taken in by the town. While it was sad to contemplate so much money being spent for liquors, the editor wrote, it was better spent in the town dispensary than in drugstores or blind tigers. Eventually, this dispensary idea spread fully across 5 southern states, with Alabama, South Carolina, and Virginia joining North Carolina and Georgia. Across these 5 states, auditors' records show that of the 102 towns that adopted dispensaries, 76 did so after experimenting with prohibition and drugstore sales first. It seems then that pharmacies occupied an important place in the attempt to end the saloon. This somewhat forgotten history likely has all sorts of ramifications, which historians have yet uncovered, and suggests a robust area for future research. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I think we can now open the floor for discussion. Okay, we have a question here. I'm not sure. Let me see who this is from. Okay, this is from Michael Lewis from Jacob Green. Michael, was there any talk about the consumption of other drugs such as opium, tobacco, or cocaine in discussion of banning alcohol? And did barroom pharmacies switch to serving other drugs after prohibition?
They did. The focus at the time was mostly to get college students to stop drinking. And so the drug of choice for most of those young people, as I suspect a lot of it is still today, was alcohol. But yes, drugstores did switch. And they switched in 2 ways that are interesting. One, they did start to sell other drugs, but the other thing they did was they turned to Coca-Cola. So that whole story, which I'm sure has been told many places better than I could possibly tell it here, was a common response. So you see pharmacies all over the South having these soda stands, and that becoming part of the story. I don't know if that answers the question well enough.
Can I just like to follow up and ask you, were these dispensaries that follow the use of the drugstore any more effective in limiting or controlling the amount of alcohol consumed?
Depends on who ran them. So in Athens, it seemed as if they did manage to do a fairly decent job of that. They put in charge of their local dispensary a deacon in the local Baptist church, and apparently he took the task fairly seriously. And there was little that stopped some of it. There's other towns sought out more profit, and when the profit motive got involved, then there was a lot less looking at that. In some instances, political considerations took over, and it became possible to use that space the way saloons were always used, as political organizing spots, and there it didn't work very well at all. So it's a wide range of results depending on how seriously the mandate was taken.
Thank you.
Yeah.
If other people have questions, please put them into the chat. Okay. Bettina has a question for Chris. Chris, in addition to thanking you for your fascinating talk, Bettina wants to know whether American Columba is identical in botanical terms with the Mosaic Columba root. That was a question I was wondering too, and Bettina says she's intrigued by the details since it shows the many oscillations between the own and the exotic.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So no, they're two different species, and I want to do more sort of kind of botanical research on here because I don't really know the different genuses. I know that the Columba root that's from Mozambique or from Southeast Africa is, and I'm probably like mispronouncing this, but I think it's like Jadiohirza palmata, whereas the Fracera carolinensis, that's probably completely off, but they're two different species. I guess what interests me though is kind of this connection of trying to find the same plant in different parts of the world. It's kind of a common sort of effort in the late 18th century, and how that, by the early 19th century, they know it's two different species, but there's, I think, something about sort of this American effort to find a Columbo of their own or a Columba of their own. When I see your other question, similar stories about China root, yeah, and I actually don't know Angelica sinensis, but certainly they're different species, but I think they kind of represent this kind of cultural imaginary among Europeans and English speakers that trying to sort of possess other medical traditions or possess other parts of the world and kind of move them around. I'm still kind of thinking about how to incorporate, though, maybe actual botanical evidence into the narrative. So thank you.
You're welcome. Another question for Michael. Do you know if any of those establishments that survived to the present, and was there a moment when the dispensary model faded away? This is from Richard Del Rio. And any differences between from the current push for dispensaries in the South for medical recreational cannabis?
Right. So this dispensary model was in place until state prohibition in many southern states, which happened just before national prohibition. They went right up to that moment, and then, of course, after the prohibition movement, they reemerged in the form of ABC stores, which is for all intents and purposes exactly the same thing. So we can almost view the prohibition movement is stopping what would have otherwise been a fairly longer run for that very same idea. There's enormous amounts of overlap with our current dispensary moment in terms of, as you listen to people talk about why they're trying to do it, what their aims are around doing it, it's exactly the same. Maybe not exactly the same. It's different in the sense that medical marijuana doesn't have nearly the lengthy history of approval that the medicinal use of alcohol does or did. So dispensaries for alcohol were a much more comfortable fit, I think, for a lot of folks back then than medical marijuana seems and dispensaries seem to be now. But the tone and tenor is pretty similar.
This also relates to a question from Greg Higbee about what happened during Prohibition. You've already addressed the fact that the dispensaries disappeared, at least temporarily, and of course pharmacies once again were dispensing prescriptions for alcohol. Isn't that correct?
Yes. So it reverted, and of course, there's all sorts of records out there, which I'd love to get into more, of physicians' prescription books that actually show who they were dispensing to, what they were dispensing, what they were doing right in the middle of Prohibition. There's so much information there that remains almost completely untapped.
Okay. I'd like to get a question now to Nydia. Nydia, we have a question to you from Zinnia Capo, who asks, mentions you talked about different experimental use of peyote, including intravenous use. Zinnia wants to know, did any of these treatments go beyond the experimental stage? And considering peyote is indigenous to Mexico, did politicians and doctors use a nationalist discourse to defend medical consumption and experimentation with peyote?
Thank you. In that moment, there is no that phases that we know today that the medicines have to pass to be a medicine. So I don't know if there are only that phase, that moment that the people, the doctors, the scientists made experiments, and that's all. If that experiments of the results are in the pharmacopoeia, that means that the doctors can use, but there's no these phases like now in that moment. And the other part of the question, politicians generally know. They more use these plans to make other policies, like for example, in education, or to make modern the people, indigenous people, and to change these practices. For doctors, sometimes yes, they say that to know like the endemic plants and the local plants, that helps to Mexico, no? To know the diversity of the plants, and some doctors, they have this nationalist discourse, but no, politicians usually, I never found that. Usually they discredit these plants.
And while you have the floor, Nydia, Lucas Rickett asks how drug legislation fits into your story, or drug legalization. Sorry.
Yeah, about 1940s. I talk about a little bit that because that legalization, it's supposed that it's based on the research of that Dr. Leopoldo Salazar Viniegra, and that's why I decided, because he is one of the main scientists in that time, in 1920s to 40s, that research about marijuana and other drugs. So when this legalization was made, he recently was the chief of the health department, not the chief of the health department, but he had a very important paper on the health department. So all their research that was like to justify that legalization. So that's why I include and talk a little bit about that moment, because that doctor have a very important paper in this moment.
Thank you. We are just about out of time. I don't know, Kristen or Luke, whether we need to end this right on time. We have more questions, but
we can keep going a bit, John. This is the last session of the day, and if people have questions, they can stick around. If they have to take off, obviously they can take off. But we've got some wiggle room to field a few more questions.
Okay, just wanted to check before doing that. So let me go to some of the other questions we have here that we didn't get to. Let's see. Michael David Hertzberg asks, what was solo versus social use as any way, at all a way that they define medical therapeutic use versus misuse? In other words, that drugs, were they intended for use alone?
Right, and that's a big undercurrent. That's really good. It's a big undercurrent underlying all of this. The big problem with the saloon was that it was socially used by people who were deemed unreliable and dangerous when using collectively. So the goal of closing saloons was not always to stop people from drinking. The goal of closing saloons was to provide social order. That's what they thought they were getting when they gave this tax to drugstores. But of course, what drugstores often did was open up right behind them in back rooms and other places where people could congregate. So part of the problem, even with drugstores, was not just the amount of liquor that was being sold, but also how still on site the kind of consumption patterns were happening. So the goal behind these dispensaries was very much to encourage social use, to encourage solo use, but also to encourage social use for men in the context of their families. There was an understanding that somehow women could control men in the house. They could not control them on Main Street. So there was that kind of dynamic going as well.
Okay, thank you. Another question for Chris. This one from Greg Bond, who wants to know or says, you talked about the Eurocentric nature of many of your sources. Can you talk a little bit about your strategies to broaden your source base to include more indigenous and marginalized voices? You're on mute.
So this is, I think, like a long-standing question for me in terms of writing history. I mean, there's ways to read, anthropology and read, I guess what we call sort of either upstreaming or downstreaming of like present-day healers in this region, Southeast Africa, but also in the Appalachian West. I'm not really certain how I feel about this approach. It seems now like one has to be kind of careful about choosing, where you take your research from. I don't know, it's just a kind of question of mine. And then the other question is like, this is coming from the perspective of studying Atlantic slavery. It's like we always want to find enslaved healers, both, enslaved African healers, and perhaps, subaltern indigenous healers in the archive. And I guess I take seriously the scholarship by people studying sort of slavery in the archive. To what extent is that desire maybe not a historical analysis, or maybe something that's reflective of our own kind of like being haunted by this, by wanting to sort of, put non-Europeans more fully into the story, into the narrative. I mean, that's something I want to do, but I'm also kind of conscious and cautious of my own sort of desire to do so. So I don't know. I think it's something that ongoing, I'm struggling with, and I would be really grateful for any advice on how to do that better here.
Okay. Don't see other questions, but there are a couple of comments here. People may want it. Joe Gabriel says, I think we should be careful about reifying botanical classification Joe, do you want to expand on that? I'm not sure what you're referring to exactly here, the way your question comes in the midst of a bunch of others.
Yeah, I mean, this was kind of a conversation that I was having with Bettina about Chris's really excellent presentation, and about the question about whether the two types of plants were the same or not. And just kind of pointing out that the distinction between plants, may have been the result of the processes that Chris is talking about, rather than something that can be reified and brought back in.
Okay, I understand. And Bettina, you mentioned there are similar stories about China root and Angelica sinensis. Do you want to expand on that?
Yeah.
How were the stories similar? And
well, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's not about naming, but it's about identifying an effect of a drug that that effect comes into the pattern of thinking of European pharmacology. So there's a fascinating story about discovering these effects for the European market and reinterpreting what Angelica sinensis was used for in the East Asian countries. And then it becomes, it gets this name because it is similar to a European drug. It belongs to the same family. So yes. I'm interested in exchanging names and exchanging attributions of effects, and also exchanging attributions of authority.
Thank you. Chris, I also think it's fascinating that the Europeans and Americans played up to some extent the connection of Columba with Native American culture or with Asia, but not the African connection. I mean, so there are these other people that are non-Europeans, the Native Americans, the Asians, but that's like a good thing that, they had this special knowledge or something, but they didn't seem to want to accept that about African healers.
Yeah, I think the key part of the paper that I'm trying to argue is that the reason that, especially in Northern Europe, Columba is described as an Asian drug for so long, until like 1819, I believe, is that I think it comes from this tradition of Orientalism, that South Asian knowledge has kind of an epistemic status similar to early modern European medicine, that's kind of valorized among European doctors. And then, in the American context, I think the sort of playing Indian, concept from settler colonial studies is what's going on with sort of American doctors trying to say that they have become Indian doctors, that they have become, connected to the American environment, that they are now Indians themselves. I mean, these are two other sort of major world epics in world history. And I think, it's this kind of stark history that, Southeast African, but also West African science and West African medicine is completely denied and downplayed in this period.
And as I'm sure you know, of course, that Indian connection was big in the patent medicines as well. All these patent medicine supposedly, discovered secret from some Indian chief had revealed the secret to some patent medicine producer.
I actually don't know that literature that well, so if anyone could send me recommendations on that, I'd be happy for that too.
Yeah. I'd like to raise one more question too for Nydia I didn't get to ask. And that is, I'm curious about, I know you didn't have time to get to this, but, why was the Mexican pharmacopoeia established in 1846. I mean, what factors prompted them to do it at that time, and was it influenced by the pharmacopoeias of specific other nations like Spain or U.S.? Nydia, you with us? There you are.
Yeah, I'm here. I think that there is a more a political situation because after the independence of Mexico in 1820, they the nation became to organize the authorities and the lawless. So I think that's more like a political thing, that in that moment the state can make this kind of manuals and to consolidate the sanitary authorities, and there's influence from I think that more from the U.S. and from in that moment from French and from France and from Spain and from UK, maybe because usually these scientists in Mexico look out to their research and to especially these countries that in that moment have more advantage in knowledge. So especially in that moment, it's a lot of influence from France. But yeah, that's it.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. Any other thoughts, or we've now run about 10 minutes over. I think it's time to call it quits for the day. Greg, Kristen, what do you think? Shall we? I don't think we have any more questions.
Yeah, if we're all through the questions, we can stop. If people want to continue talking, they're more than welcome to. The room will stay open for a little while. So.
Okay, and I do want to thank our speakers again for fascinating presentations, and thank everybody who joined and contributed questions and all. And of course, thank Luke and Greg and Kristen for organizing this. And we've got some more interesting sessions coming over the next few days. Okay, well, I will leave it open. I'll stay on in case anyone else, but I also will turn it back to Kristen and Greg. And again, as they said, if people want to continue discussing, talking to each other, I guess you can just shout out.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, John.
You're welcome.